Jar Oil. The company have filling stations across the country, and our rates are relatively cheaper than anyone else across the country. Jar Oil is the biggest producer and distributor of cement in the country with the most competitive prices in the market.
Excellent jam, Suwaib.
Yo, apply. Yo, luta to dede. Luta mo nulo jel mo to nga andil mahalis. Hello?
Bisul mo fine.
What?
Bisul mo fine.
Oh, yes!
Wave Axina Gambia. Deposit and withdraw money, pay bills and buy mobile credit without fees. Transfer money wherever in the country for only 1% fee. At Wave. Bisul mo fine? Wave. Your money is yours.
Now, as we reach the midway point of 2025, the political landscape is more dynamic than ever. A wave of new political parties is gearing up for the 2026 elections, signaling a transformative era in the nation's democracy. But does the emergence of new parties and new presidential aspirants offer citizens more choices that align with their expectations? Well, let's hear from former Army commander, author, and political and security analyst Sheriff Samsudeen Sarr, commenting, as always, through his radio alter ego, Lamin Cham of the Standard newspaper.
As dawn broke over the Atlantic on Tuesday morning, June the 10th, I undertook my customary ritual of heading to the beach for a rejuvenating swim. Immersed in the semi-warm waters of the River Gambia, I allowed the tides to wash away mental clutter before settling onto the sand, my phone in hand, searching for the digital horizon for a spark of inspiration. This has become a personal tradition, an informal writer's retreat, particularly useful when the muse grows reticent. As I browsed through online headlines, a few intriguing themes emerged. I didn't ferret in deeply into the articles themselves, but the mere thrust of their titles was enough to steer my thoughts and compel a commentary on the current political situation of our country. One particular headline attributed to the Emir of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat in the Gambia resonated with me. It framed Eid al-Adha or Tabaski as a sacred time for self-reflection. Although I find little urgency at this stage in my life to undertake a personal audit, I do believe this is a fitting moment for collective introspection and political forecasting as the Gambia inches closer to the critical 2026 presidential election. Among the more eye-catching headlines was one published in the Standard on June the 5th, entitled, "Jegan calls for national dialogue for a united opposition." Accompanying the headline was a photograph of prominent opposition figures, Ousainou Darboe of the UDP, Halifa Sallah of DOI, Essa Mbaye of the APP Sobaya Alliance, and Mama Kende of the GDC. The call for unity is noble, if not nostalgic. I am unsure who Jegan is, but the plea smacks of a yearning for a reprise of the 2016 coalition triumph, an extraordinary convergence that I dare say is very unlikely to be replicated. I shall elaborate momentarily. Elsewhere, the proliferation of political movements continues at a frantic pace. New parties are emerging, one being championed by one Ustaz Musa Jallow, another breakaway faction from the NPP of President Barrow under the stewardship of one Mr. Keba Madi Bojang, and others by Mamadou Bah and former Vice President Bakari Bunja Dabo, and most recently, former diplomat Essa Bokar C. In fact, Essa Bokar C even issued a dramatic caveat to President Barrow, urging him not to seek re-election, and portraying such a move as tantamount to a constitutionally forbidden third term. That claim by Essa Bokar C, however, does not hold water because the 1997 Constitution, which is still the supreme law of the land, places no limit on presidential terms. Unless a new constitution, such as the still dormant drafts of 2020 or 2024, is passed and explicitly applied retroactively, which seems highly improbable before 2026, President Barrow is within his legal rights to seek another term, and rightly so. To be clear, I myself have consistently advocated for presidential term limits. In fact, in my manuscript, Coup d'etat by the Gambia National Army, published in 2007, I emphatically called for a 2-term ceiling on the presidency. On page 142, chapter 11, I wrote, and I quote, "After 30 years of the same leader, the country should never allow a president to stay in power for more than 2 terms of 5 years each, a maximum of 10 years." Unquote. That sentiment was embedded in the original draft of the inaugural policy speech I was commissioned to write for the Armed Forces Provisional Ruling Council, AFPRC, back in 1994. Alas, that key clause was taken out before Chairman Jammeh delivered speech on Radio Gambia. I collaborated closely with the late journalist and literary icon Swaibu Konate to finalize that document, a fact uncontested until 2018. To this day, I remain convinced that long-term incumbency, particularly in post-colonial African states, poses an existential threat to democratic governance. It breeds an insidious addiction to power and often mutates into authoritarianism. Term limits would not only institutionalize accountability, but also reinforce the temporariness of political power. Unless, of course, leaders choose to emulate the perilous paths of Alpha Condé in Guinea, Macky Sall in Senegal, or Alassane Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire. Thankfully, Senegal turned a corner in 2024 when courageous leaders defied that very trend. It was painful but necessary. Now, going back to my beachside reflections, another headline piqued my interest. This one featured Mama Kande of the GDC, who publicly dispelled long-circulating assumptions that he had already entered into a political alliance with Barrow's NPP. While affirming no such deal exists, Kande left the door open to future collaboration, a considerable shift for a man who has historically eschewed any overtures toward Barrow. More provocatively, Mama Kande posited that apart from his GDC, Barrow's NPP and Dabo's UDP, no other party currently commands meaningful grassroots support. In his view, the GDC could emerge as the decisive swing actor in 2026, willing to tilt the scale in exchange for political concessions, provided leadership remains in Barrow's hands. This leads me to an analytical forecast. President Barrow will contest in 2026, and as before, he will extend an olive branch to any party willing to join his camp. Should Mama Kande align with him, some form of political accommodation may be anticipated, but Barrow will not relinquish the helm. On the other hand, the UDP remains the most formidable opposition bloc in terms of voter base. However, any viable coalition such as the one Jegan proposes will likely falter unless Ousainou Darboe is allowed to lead. The UDP has made this stipulation unmistakably clear. It is a reality that all potential partners must accept if a unified opposition is to materialize. That said, if the UDP earnestly seeks victory in 2026, it must be willing to engage in realpolitik, including forming alliances with unlikely and even controversial partners such as the APRC. Emotional baggage and past traumas cannot be permitted to sabotage strategic opportunity. Gambian politics is less about ideology or principle and more about arithmetic. The road to State House is paved with numbers, not sentiment and insults. This ultimately is why President Barrow remains the man to beat. Despite the criticisms he routinely faces, he is open to dialogue, more accommodating than many of his adversaries, and crucially, he enjoys the indisputable age of incumbency. As the tides of Tabaski roll in, perhaps it is not just individuals who must reflect, but political actors too. For, in the delicate game of Gambian democracy, clarity, compromise, and coalition may well prove more valuable than charisma or conviction alone.
Lamin Cham with the thoughts of political and security analyst Sheriff Samsudeen Sarr, a retired lieutenant colonel who once commanded the Gambia National Army.
Jar Oil, the company, have filling stations across the country, and our rates are relatively cheaper than anyone else across the country. Jar Oil is the biggest producer and distributor of cement in the country with the most competitive prices in the market.
Excellent jam, Suway.
Yo, apply. Yo, luta do dede. Luta mënulo jël moto nga andil ma xaalis. Hello? Kan lay waxal?
Bisul mu fine.
What?
Bisul mu fine.
Oh, yes!
Wave Gambia. Deposit and withdraw money, pay bills and buy mobile credit without fees. Transfer money wherever in the country for only 1% fee. At Wave, Basel Mufine, Wave, your money is yours.